If someone had asked me a year ago whether love could survive thousands of miles, I would have answered without hesitation, yes. Not because I was naive, but because I believed in us. My name is Daniel, and I have been married to my wife, Elena, for 8 years. Before the distance, before time zones and late-night calls, we had a marriage that felt steady, quietly strong, like an old oak tree that bends in storms but never breaks. We were never the dramatic couple. We didn't shout our love from rooftops. We built it in routines: Sunday morning coffee, shared grocery lists, her cold feet pressing against my legs in bed. Then came the opportunity. Elena was offered a 2-year research position overseas, something she had worked toward for most of her adult life. I remember the night she told me. Her eyes shone with excitement, but underneath it was fear. She was waiting for me to hesitate, waiting for me to say it was too far, too hard, too much. Instead, I told her I was proud. I meant it. We agreed it would be temporary, a sacrifice for the future we were building. I stayed behind because my work couldn't move and because someone needed to hold our life in place. Our apartment, our bills, the shape of home. We promised each other that distance was geography, not emotion. At first, it almost felt romantic. We scheduled video calls like dates. I'd cook dinner while she ate breakfast. I would fall asleep to the sound of her voice through my headphones. She'd send me photos of narrow streets and unfamiliar skies. I'd send her pictures of the cat curled in her favorite chair, proof that home was still waiting. But distance does something strange to time. Days stretch differently when you are alone. Evenings become longer. Silence becomes louder. The space beside me in bed wasn't just empty. It felt symbolic. A quiet reminder that love, no matter how strong, has weight. And when you carry it alone, you feel it more. Still, I trusted her completely. Not blindly, but deeply. Elena had always been loyal, steady, grounded. If there was one thing I never doubted, it was her heart. We spoke every day. We told each other about work frustrations, about small victories, about missing each other in ordinary ways. I believed we were navigating the distance together. What I didn't yet understand was that distance doesn't just test love. It tests loneliness. And loneliness can whisper things that love tries to silence. At the time, I thought we were strong enough to endure anything. I didn't know that the real challenge of loving someone far away isn't the miles between you. It's the invisible spaces that slowly grow inside you. At first, the time difference felt like a puzzle we could solve. I set alarms for her mornings. She stayed up late for my evenings. We laughed about the absurdity of wishing each other good night and good morning in the same conversation. It felt intimate, like we were the only two people awake in the world. But slowly, something shifted. Her calls became shorter. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually. 10 minutes less here. A distracted pause there. Sometimes she would say she was exhausted. Other times she had a group dinner, or a late meeting, or just needed sleep. All of it made sense. That's what made it hard. I didn't have proof of anything. I didn't even have suspicion, just a feeling. A faint tightening in my chest when she didn't answer right away. A strange awareness when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes on the screen. I told myself it was stress. New country, new job, new people. Meanwhile, my life remained almost painfully the same. I went to work. I came home. I watered the plants she had named. I folded laundry on our bed and avoided looking at her empty side of the closet for too long. I started sleeping on my side of the mattress, as if preserving hers made her absence easier to bear. Loneliness doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in quietly. At night, I would scroll through our old photos. Vacations, holidays, random selfies in the kitchen. In every picture, we were close, physically close, touching, leaning into each other. The kind of closeness you don't realize is precious until it's gone. One evening, during a call, I noticed something small. She kept glancing to the side, smiling faintly at something off camera. Is someone there? I asked lightly. No, she replied quickly. Just a message. I nodded. I smiled. I told myself not to overthink it. But after we hung up, I stared at my phone longer than usual. For the first time, I wondered what her life looked like when I wasn't on the screen. Who she laughed with. Who she walked beside on those narrow streets she photographed. Who saw her expressions in real time, not pixelated and delayed. Distance doesn't just create space. It creates imagination. And imagination, when fed by loneliness, can be cruel. That night, I lay awake listening to the silence of our apartment. It felt heavier than before. Not because I believed she had done something wrong, but because I was beginning to feel something fragile forming between us. Not betrayal. Not yet. Just distance that no map could measure. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in long-distance relationships. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of presence. Elena and I still spoke every day. We still said, "I miss you." We still ended every call with "I love you." The words hadn't changed, but the weight behind them had. I began noticing how often she multitasked during our calls. The soft clicking of her keyboard. The brief glance downward at her phone. Once, she muted herself for nearly a minute and came back smiling apologetically. "Sorry, someone from the lab had a question." Someone. The word lingered longer than it should have. I hated myself for noticing these things. I didn't want to become the insecure husband counting seconds of eye contact. I prided myself on being steady, rational. Elena deserved trust, not interrogation. Still, something inside me had started keeping score. How many times did she cancel a call this week? How often did she seem distracted? When did her laughter start sounding different? I tried to compensate. I sent her longer messages. Voice notes about my day. Small details she used to love. How the barista at our cafe still spells her name wrong. How the neighbor's dog keeps escaping into our hallway. I wanted to anchor her to home. To remind her that we had a shared world beyond screens. Sometimes she responded warmly. Other times her replies were short, delayed. "I'm just tired, Daniel. It's been a long day. Don't overthink." I wasn't accusing her of anything. But the fact that she said, "Don't overthink," told me she sensed something in my tone. And that scared me more than anything. Because it meant the distance wasn't invisible anymore. One night, I asked her gently, "Are you happy there?" She paused. It was only a second. But when you live thousands of miles apart, a second feels like an eternity. "Yes," she said finally. "It's challenging, but I'm learning so much. It's good for me." Good for me. I nodded. I smiled. I told her I was proud. But after the call ended, I sat in the dark living room and let the quiet settle around me. Of course it was good for her. That was the point. What I hadn't prepared myself for was the possibility that something could be good for her and slowly pull her away from me at the same time. Love on the same continent feels solid, tangible. Love across oceans feels theoretical. You believe in it. You speak about it. You protect it. But you cannot touch it. And lately, I was beginning to wonder whether she still felt the same urgency to hold on as tightly as I did. I trusted her. I kept telling myself that. But trust, when tested by distance, doesn't just require faith in your partner. It requires faith in your own ability not to unravel. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore the quiet fear growing inside me. We had planned it for months. I would fly out in October. 10 days together. No screens. No delays. Just us, in the same physical space again. I counted down to that trip like a lifeline. Every lonely evening felt temporary because October was waiting for me. When I finally stepped off the plane and saw her standing near the arrival's gate, my chest tightened the way it used to when we were dating. She looked the same, and not the same at all. Her hair was a little shorter. She stood differently. More confident. More independent. But when she ran into my arms, everything quieted. For a moment, distance dissolved. Her body felt familiar. The way she fit against me. The scent of her shampoo. The warmth of her skin. I hadn't realized how touch-starved I'd become until that second. "I missed you," she whispered into my shoulder. "I know," I said. And I believed her. The first 2 days were easy. We explored her new city. She showed me the lab where she worked. Introduced me to colleagues whose names I'd heard through phone speakers for months. I watched her in her environment. Laughing, explaining something passionately, moving through conversations with ease. I felt proud. But beneath that pride, there was something else. I was no longer the center of her world here. Back home, we were each other's default. Here, she had routines I didn't belong to. Cafes where the barista already knew her order. Inside jokes with people I had just met. A life that functioned perfectly well without me. On the 4th night, we went to dinner with a small group from her lab. That's when I met him. His name was Adrian. He was friendly, polite, intelligent. The kind of man you immediately understand is competent and self-assured. When he spoke to Elena, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They teased each other lightly. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing obvious. But I noticed how often she looked at him when he was talking, even when he wasn't addressing her directly. I told myself I was imagining it. Still, I watched. Later that night, back in her apartment, I asked casually, "You and Adrian seem close." She shrugged. "We work on the same project. We spend a lot of time together." It was a reasonable answer. I nodded and kissed her forehead. But as we lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the way she laughed at something he said. The way he placed his hand briefly on the small of her back while moving past her in the restaurant. It was subtle, innocent even, but distance sharpens your sensitivity. When you've spent months holding on to someone through a screen, you notice the way another person occupies space near them. The next morning, I tried to shake the feeling. I didn't want to be that husband, the jealous one, the suspicious one. Love requires trust, especially long-distance love. But as the days passed, I felt something I couldn't name. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't proof. It was the unsettling realization that while I had been preserving our life back home, she had been building one here, and I didn't know where I fit in it anymore. The last 2 days of my visit felt different. Not colder, not distant, just layered, as if there were conversations happening beneath the ones we were actually having. On my 9th night there, Elena told me she needed to stop by the lab for an hour. Something urgent, she said. A data issue before Monday. I offered to come along. She hesitated. It was brief, almost invisible, but after months of watching her through a screen, I had become highly attuned to her pauses. "It'll be boring," she said quickly. "You should rest. You fly tomorrow." I smiled. "I don't mind." Another pause. Then she nodded. "Okay." The lab building was nearly empty when we arrived. The halls were quiet, lit by soft overhead lights that made everything feel slightly unreal. She walked ahead of me confidently, like she belonged there. Because she did. When we reached her office, the door was slightly open, and Adrian was inside. He looked up, surprised, but not confused. "Oh," he said, standing. "You made it." "Made it." Not, "Oh, I didn't know you were coming." Not, "I was just leaving." Elena stepped forward quickly. "I told you I'd stop by." My chest tightened. They had planned this. It wasn't a coincidence. They spoke in professional tones, discussing numbers and revisions. I stood near the door, feeling like an observer in my own marriage. At one point, Adrian leaned over her shoulder to look at something on the screen. Their heads were close. Too close. I told myself I was overreacting. But then I saw it. Her hand rested on the desk. His fingers brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't passionate. It was familiar. Comfortable. That was worse. When he finally left, he gave her a look I couldn't decode. Something quiet. Something shared. I waited until we were outside before speaking. "Was that really about data?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "Daniel." The way she said my name told me everything. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Guilt. "Is there something you need to tell me?" My voice was calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked away. And in that silence, longer than any time zone delay, heavier than any quiet apartment back home, I understood that distance hadn't just tested us. It had changed us. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like they passed through me rather than into me. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I stared at her, waiting for the sentence to complete itself. "I was lonely," she continued. "You were far. Everything was new. He was just there." Lonely. The same word that had been echoing inside me for months. Only she hadn't carried it alone. In that moment, the city around us felt foreign and unfamiliar. I realized that while I had been counting down days to hold her again, she had already begun letting go. And I was standing in a country I didn't know, listening to my wife confess that love, stretched across an ocean, had finally torn. I didn't mean for it to happen. The sentence replayed in my head long after she said it, like a recording I couldn't shut off. We stood outside the lab building, the air cool and sharp against my face. People passed us on the sidewalk, laughing, talking, living ordinary lives. And there we were, our marriage quietly splitting open under streetlights. "How long?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded controlled, detached, as if I were asking about something abstract. She wrapped her arms around herself. "A few weeks," she said. "It wasn't planned. It just grew. Grew. As if it were something natural. Like a plant leaning toward sunlight." "And what is it?" I asked. "An emotional affair? Physical?" She hesitated again. That hesitation was worse than any word she could have chosen. It's not just emotional, she admitted. I felt something inside my chest collapse inward. Not explode, not shatter dramatically, just sink. For months, I had been sleeping alone in our bed, holding on to memories, defending her in conversations when friends joked about long-distance marriages failing. I had trusted her so completely that doubt felt like betrayal on my part. And all that time, she had been sharing herself with someone else. I was lonely too, I said quietly. She looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time that night, her expression shifted from guilt to something closer to realization. I know, she whispered. No, I said. I don't think you do. The truth was simple and brutal. I had chosen loyalty every day. Not because it was easy, because it mattered. Because she mattered. I had missed her so much it physically hurt sometimes. I had stared at her empty side of the closet like it was sacred space. I had counted days like they were currency, and she had filled her loneliness differently. I never stopped loving you, she said quickly, almost desperately. This didn't replace you. But love doesn't exist in isolation from action. If you love someone, you protect them, even when they aren't there to see it. That's what I had believed. Standing there, I realized something painful. Distance doesn't create new desires. It reveals the cracks that were already there. Do you want to be with him? I asked. It was the question that mattered. She closed her eyes briefly. I don't know. That was the moment the ground truly shifted beneath me. Not the confession, not the physical betrayal, but the uncertainty. Because infidelity born from confusion is harder to fight than infidelity born from malice. There was no villain here. No dramatic seduction. Just proximity, opportunity, loneliness, and a choice she had made more than once. I felt anger rising then. Not loud, not explosive, but steady, controlled, cold. I came here to feel close to you again, I said. And instead I find out I've been competing with someone who didn't have to try nearly as hard. Tears slipped down her face. She reached for my hand. I stepped back. Not dramatically, just enough to feel the space between us. For months, that space had been measured in miles. Now it was measured in truth. And I didn't know which distance was harder to cross. We walked back to her apartment in silence. Not the comfortable silence we once shared, the kind filled with unspoken understanding. This silence was heavy, sharp-edged. Every step felt deliberate, like we were moving through the wreckage of something fragile we had both once believed was unbreakable. Inside, the apartment looked the same as it had all week. Her jacket draped over the chair. 2 coffee mugs in the sink. A book open on the table. Normal things. That's what made it unbearable. I stood in the middle of the room, suddenly unsure of where I belonged. I had slept there for 9 nights. I had left my suitcase near the wall. But now it felt like I was occupying space that wasn't mine anymore. Elena, I said quietly, when were you going to tell me? She didn't answer right away. I didn't know if it meant anything, she said finally. I thought it might pass. Pass. Like a cold. Like bad weather. But it didn't, I replied. She shook her head. The honesty hurt more than any lie would have. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The same bed where we had tried to reconnect physically just days before. I felt a wave of nausea when I realized that even then, she had already crossed the line. Was it while we were still talking every night? I asked. Her silence answered for her. The images that formed in my mind were cruel and relentless. Me falling asleep with headphones in, telling her I loved her. Her saying it back. And somewhere in that same timeline him. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to steady myself. Anger would have been easier. If she had been cruel or dismissive, I could have built a wall. But she looked broken, conflicted, guilty, and that complicated everything. I didn't plan to fall for him, she whispered. It just happened. He understands this world I'm in right now. The pressure, the pace. I looked up at her. And I don't. That's not what I meant. But that's what you're saying. Distance had done what arguments never could. It had placed us in separate realities. I was preserving the life we built. She was evolving into something new. And somewhere along the way, we stopped evolving together. I need to ask you something, I said carefully. If I hadn't come here, would this still be happening? Her face tightened. Yes. The word was quiet, but it landed like thunder. That was the truth I needed. Not the details. Not the excuses. Just the reality that this wasn't a mistake she was already correcting. It was a choice she was still living in. I stood up and walked to the window. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Somewhere out there was the man who had slowly replaced my absence. I felt grief more than rage. Grief for the version of us I thought we still were. I don't know what to do, she said behind me. For months, I had believed that surviving distance required strength. Now I understood something harder. Surviving betrayal requires clarity. And for the first time since I arrived, my thoughts were becoming painfully clear. I couldn't fight for someone who didn't know if they still wanted to be mine. I couldn't compete with proximity. I couldn't repair something alone. I turned back to her. You don't get to be uncertain, I said softly. Not after this. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, and I realized that the hardest part wasn't losing her. It was accepting that she had already begun letting me go. I didn't sleep that night. Elena lay on one side of the bed, turned away from me. I lay on the other, staring at the ceiling, watching faint shadows move across it as headlights passed outside. The physical distance between us was maybe a foot. It felt infinite. At some point near dawn, I realized something unsettling. The shock had worn off. What remained was clarity. Painful, steady clarity. When you first learn about betrayal, your mind scrambles for explanations. You search for misunderstandings, for context that will soften the blow. But once the truth settles, something else happens. You begin to see your relationship without illusions. In the quiet morning light, I replayed the last 6 months. The shorter calls, the distracted smiles, the emotional subtlety that I had dismissed as stress. It hadn't happened overnight. It had unfolded slowly, quietly, like a door closing inch by inch. And I had been standing on the other side, knocking gently, thinking it was still open. When Elena woke, her eyes were swollen. She looked fragile. I don't want to lose you, she said immediately, as if the sentence had been waiting all night. I studied her carefully. Then why did you risk me? I asked. She didn't have a clean answer. Only feelings. Confusion. Loneliness. Connection. That word again. Connection. Long-distance love demands constant intentional connection. Without it, other connections grow more easily because they are present, immediate, effortless. I felt alive here, she admitted, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The honesty hurt, but it also revealed something deeper than the affair. When did you stop feeling alive with me? I asked quietly. Her eyes filled again. I don't know. That was the real fracture. Not Adrian. Not the physical betrayal. But the fact that somewhere along our marriage, something vital had faded, and neither of us had named it. Distance hadn't created the problem. It had exposed it. I stood up and began packing my suitcase slowly. Each folded shirt felt symbolic. Like I was folding up expectations, memories, plans. Elena, I said carefully, I need to know one thing before I leave. She looked at me, terrified of what I might ask. If I give you space to decide, real space, not emotional limbo, will you be honest with yourself? She nodded, but her nod carried uncertainty. I can't fight for you while you're choosing between us, I continued. I won't beg. I won't compete. I deserve more than that. For the first time, I heard firmness in my own voice. Not anger. Self-respect. Love doesn't mean abandoning your dignity. She walked toward me, reaching for my hand. This time, I didn't step back, but I didn't close the distance either. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I know, I said, and I meant it. That was what made it tragic. She hadn't set out to destroy us. She had simply drifted toward what felt close while I remained far away. But intentions don't erase consequences. As I zipped my suitcase shut, I realized that the man who had arrived 9 days earlier was not the same man standing there now. I had come to reconnect. I was leaving with a choice to make. Not just about my marriage, but about myself. Airports are strange places when your life feels like it's collapsing. People rush past you with excitement, anticipation, impatience. Reunions, vacations, business trips. And there you are, carrying something invisible and heavy through security like it's just another item in your bag. Elena came with me to the airport. We stood near the entrance longer than necessary, both of us aware that this goodbye was not like the others. Before, our goodbyes had been temporary, structured, scheduled. I'll call you when I land, I said automatically. The habit almost made me laugh. She nodded, but neither of us believed in the simplicity of that routine anymore. Daniel, please don't shut me out, she said softly. I looked at her for a long moment. I won't, I replied. But I won't pretend nothing happened either. There was no dramatic embrace. No desperate promises. Just a quiet, aching uncertainty. When I turned and walked toward security, I didn't look back immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to feel what it was like to walk away without reassurance. On the plane, I stared out the window as the city shrank beneath the clouds. Somewhere down there was my wife. Somewhere down there was the man she had let into the space that used to belong only to me. I expected rage to take over once I was alone. Instead, I felt grief. Grief for the version of our marriage I had believed in. Grief for the simplicity we once had. Grief for the man I was before doubt entered my mind. For months, I had been afraid of losing her to distance. Now I understood something more painful. I had already lost the certainty of us. And certainty is the foundation of peace. During the long flight home, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not beg. I would not try to outcompete proximity. I would not reduce myself to someone anxiously waiting for a decision about whether I was enough. Love requires effort. Yes, but it also requires reciprocity. When I finally unlocked the door to our apartment, the silence greeted me like an old friend. Only this time, it felt different. Before, the emptiness had carried hope because she was coming back eventually. Now, it carried questions. I walked into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her pillow was still there. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Nothing had physically changed, and yet everything had. I realized that the hardest part of betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the way it rewrites your memories. I began questioning things I once trusted completely. Had she already been drifting before she left? Had I missed signs long ago? Or had distance truly transformed her into someone I didn't recognize? That night, I didn't call her. For the first time since she moved away, we went a full day without speaking. And in that silence, I felt something unexpected. Not just pain, but the beginning of independence. Because if I was going to survive this, whether with her or without her, I needed to remember who I was outside of waiting. And that realization, small as it was, felt like the first steady ground I had touched in months. The first week back home felt unreal. I moved through my routines mechanically, work, groceries, laundry, as if nothing had changed. On the outside, my life looked exactly the same as it had before I visited her. But internally, everything had shifted. Elena texted the day after I arrived. "Did you land safely?" I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Yes, that was it. No heart emoji. No "I miss you already." No automatic warmth. Silence stretched between us in a new way now, not because of time zones, but because of truth. Over the next few days, she tried to call twice. I let it ring the first time. The second time, I answered. Seeing her face on the screen again felt surreal. A week earlier, I had been standing in the same room as her. Now we were back to pixels and delays, but with knowledge neither of us could ignore. "I've been thinking," she said. "I hope so," I replied quietly. She winced slightly. I hadn't meant it to sound sharp, but pain has edges. "I ended it," she continued. My heart reacted before my mind did. A flicker of relief. Then caution. "When?" I asked. 2 days ago. 2 days. That meant it hadn't ended immediately after our confrontation. It had continued, even briefly, after I left. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. "Why?" I asked. She looked confused. "Because I don't want to lose you." That answer should have comforted me. But it didn't. "Did you end it because you chose me?" I asked carefully. "Or because you were afraid of what you'd lose?" Her silence told me she hadn't fully separated those two things. This was the complexity no one talks about with betrayal. It's not just about the act. It's about the intention that follows. I didn't want to be someone's safe option. I wanted to be chosen with certainty. "I need time," I told her. "Not to punish you, but to understand whether I can rebuild trust or whether I'm trying to preserve something that already changed too much." Tears filled her eyes again. "I'll wait," she said. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I had been the one waiting. Waiting for visits, for calls, for reassurance. Now she was the one asking for patience. After the call ended, I sat quietly in the living room. Ending an affair doesn't erase it. It doesn't rewind the timeline. It doesn't restore innocence. Trust, once fractured, doesn't magically reset. But something inside me felt steadier than before. Not because the pain was gone, but because I was no longer operating in confusion. The truth was out in the open. And truth, even when it hurts, is easier to navigate than doubt. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself for a long time. I wasn't broken. I was hurt. Yes, but I was still whole. And for the first time since discovering everything, I understood something clearly. Whether this marriage survived or not, I would not abandon myself to keep it alive. That realization didn't erase the ache, but it gave me something stronger than anger. It gave me boundaries. And boundaries, I was beginning to learn, are what allow love to either rebuild or end with dignity. The days after that conversation were quieter than I expected. I moved through them almost like a ghost, performing familiar tasks while my mind replayed scenes, conversations, and moments with Elena. I stopped counting calls. I stopped sending long voice notes. I let her reach out first if she chose to. And most of the time, she didn't. It was the first time in years that I was living without the constant rhythm of us. The apartment, which had once felt empty in her absence, now felt like my own. Not the shared home we had built together, but mine, raw, honest, and unembellished. I began noticing things I hadn't before. The way sunlight hit the kitchen counter in the mornings, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creaks of the floorboards. I started running again, not to escape, but to reconnect with myself. Each step reminded me that I existed outside of her, outside of the marriage, outside of the distance. Loneliness came in waves. Some nights, it hit me like a physical blow. I would scroll through old photos on my phone, reliving vacations, meals, laughter, the ordinary life we once had. But unlike before, I didn't drown in despair. I acknowledged it, felt it, sat with it, let it be. Elena's presence over screens felt different now. When she called, I listened. I answered. But I no longer pretended that a smile through pixels could fill the gaps of months spent apart. I realized something fundamental. Long distance doesn't just test love, it exposes it. Every insecurity, every unspoken frustration, every imbalance in effort becomes magnified. And sometimes, it reveals truths we aren't ready to face. I wasn't ready to decide whether our marriage would survive, but I was ready to stop pretending that my only worth was tied to her affection, her attention, or her choices. For the first time, I felt like I had a foothold in my own life. And that was the first step toward either rebuilding the relationship or letting it go without losing myself. I started to reclaim small pieces of myself. Nothing dramatic, no grand gestures or life-altering decisions, just tiny, deliberate acts that reminded me I was still here, still whole, still capable of joy outside of Elena. I returned to the cafe we had once gone to every Sunday. I ordered my usual coffee and let myself linger, watching strangers' lives unfold in front of me. I smiled at the barista when she got my name wrong, remembering that some things hadn't changed. I even laughed quietly at myself when a couple nearby argued about something trivial, thinking of how easily I used to get frustrated in our own arguments. I picked up my old sketchbook again, something I had abandoned years ago because life had become too practical, too predictable. Lines and shapes started to flow from my pen, messy at first, then clearer. I realized I had forgotten what it felt like to create something solely for myself. Work became a refuge, not because it mattered more, but because I allowed myself to focus fully on it, without the emotional distraction of trying to maintain a perfect connection with someone thousands of miles away. I even found a small rhythm in commuting, in walking to meetings, in typing reports. Each mundane task felt grounding. And yet, even as I rebuilt small fragments of my life, I couldn't ignore the tug of longing. I still loved her. I still missed her. And sometimes, late at night, I would imagine what it would feel like if she truly chose to come back. If she was fully present, fully honest, fully mine again. But the difference now was crucial. I understood that love without certainty, or at least reciprocal commitment, wasn't love. It was waiting. And waiting, I realized, could slowly erode the self. I started journaling my feelings. Not for her. Not for anyone. Just for me. Anger, grief, love, frustration, hope. They all poured out on paper in ways I hadn't let myself articulate for months. I discovered that articulating them made the feelings manageable, even if the pain remained. For the first time since discovering the affair, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and empowerment. I was still heartbroken, but I wasn't broken. And in that subtle, quiet distinction, I realized the first lesson of long-distance love and of betrayal. Survival begins with oneself. After nearly 2 weeks of silence and careful self-rebuilding, Elena called me. I stared at her name on the screen for a long moment. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. But something inside me, a quiet curiosity, maybe a need for closure, made me answer. "Hi," I said, my voice steady but guarded. "Hi," she replied. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Softer, almost tentative. "I wanted to check in," she said, "to see how you're doing." I took a deep breath. "I'm managing. And you?" She hesitated. Then, "I've been thinking about us. About what happened. About how we drifted." I realized then that this call wasn't just about guilt. She wanted clarity, just as I did. "Do you regret it?" I asked directly. Her pause was long. Longer than anything else in our conversations these days. "I regret hurting you," she said finally. "Not being able to handle the distance, but I don't regret feeling alive. I don't know how to explain it." "You hurt me," I said quietly, "and I need to know if you're choosing to fix this, or if you're still unsure." Her silence was loud. "I want to fix this," she said slowly. "But I understand if you can't, if it's too late." I swallowed the lump in my throat. The truth was, I wasn't sure yet. I still loved her. I still ached for her. But trust isn't something you reclaim with words alone. It's earned, day by day, action by action. "I need time," I said. "Not to punish you, not to hurt you, but to figure out if we can rebuild this, or if I need to rebuild myself without you." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded, or maybe I imagined the nod through the screen. And for the first time, I felt like we were speaking honestly. Not as a couple trying to maintain an image, not as two people hiding behind love, but as two human beings confronting pain, choices, and distance. We hung up after a few more minutes. I sat in silence for a long while, letting the conversation settle. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was the first honest step we had taken in months. And sometimes, I realized, honesty, even when it hurts, is the only foundation strong enough to rebuild anything. The days after that conversation were quieter than any I had experienced in years. I had always been alone before Elena moved abroad, long before marriage, even, but now this solitude felt different. It wasn't the kind I could fill with distractions or routines. It was deliberate. It was reflective. It demanded attention to the cracks that had grown inside me during our long-distance separation. I stopped scrolling through her social media. I deleted the notifications that once drew me into her world, the glimpses of her life without me. Each post I avoided was a small reclaiming of my own mind, my own space. I started walking in the evenings, longer than I used to. I traced familiar streets and parks, noticing details I had ignored when my mind was consumed with worry. The sound of leaves underfoot, the smell of rain lingering in the air, the subtle hum of the city at twilight. It was grounding, healing, a reminder that life continues, even when love falters. I also reconnected with friends I had neglected. I shared laughter with them again, not about Elena, not about us, but about the mundane absurdities of daily life. I realized how much I had insulated myself, waiting for her voice, her attention, her reassurance. And through it all, the ache remained. It was quieter now, less jagged, but persistent, a reminder that love doesn't vanish overnight. I still loved her, still missed her, still wondered what our life could have been. But I understood something vital. Love alone is not enough to sustain a relationship. It cannot replace presence, effort, or honesty. I was learning, painfully, that rebuilding trust, or moving on, requires time, patience, and an unflinching look at reality. In this solitude, I began to feel a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: strength. Not the kind that comes from anger, not the kind that comes from denial, but the quiet, steady strength of a man remembering who he is without someone else defining him. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I might survive this heartbreak, not unscathed, but intact. One evening, I found myself in the bedroom we had shared for so many years. It smelled faintly of her perfume, the kind she always wore when she knew we'd be leaving the house together. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the quilt we had chosen together. For a long time, I let myself remember. The laughter over burnt toast on Sunday mornings. Her hand brushing against mine when we walked through the park. The quiet nights spent reading side by side. The moments that had once felt eternal. And then, the memories cut sharply. The subtle changes during her time abroad. The distracted smiles over video calls. The late-night texts she claimed were just work-related. The presence of someone else she had let into her life while I had been holding everything together back home. It hurt. It hurt in ways I didn't know were possible, soft, constant, like a dull ache beneath the ribs. Not a sudden blow, but a reminder that some things, once broken, cannot be restored to exactly what they were. I realized then that love is never a static thing. It grows, shifts, and sometimes withers in ways that distance magnifies. Long-distance love requires not just trust, but resilience, and even the strongest love can be tested beyond its limits. As I sat there, I felt both grief and clarity. Grief for what we had lost, clarity for what I could no longer ignore. I couldn't pretend the past weeks hadn't happened. I couldn't unsee what I had witnessed. Yet amidst the sorrow, there was a faint but persistent awareness. I could still move forward. I could still choose myself. I could honor the love we had shared without sacrificing my dignity, my peace, or my future. That night, I didn't call her. I didn't write to her. I let the memories settle, letting the emotions flow freely for the first time in months. Sometimes, I realized, surviving love from a distance isn't about holding on. It's about understanding what you are holding on to, and whether it is still there. The next morning, I woke up early. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that allows thoughts to stretch out fully, unguarded. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the gray light filtering through the blinds. I began writing. Not to Elena, not to anyone. Just words on paper, fragments of thought, emotion, and truth I hadn't dared confront before. I wrote about my grief, my anger, my lingering love, and my confusion. I wrote about the loneliness that distance had created and the betrayal that had followed. For the first time, the act of articulating everything made the emotions feel manageable. Not gone, but ordered. Not chaotic, but comprehensible. Then I made a list, not of accusations, not of blame, but of facts. Things I knew without interpretation or assumption. She had been unfaithful. The affair occurred while she was abroad. She ended it after I returned. She expressed regret, but admitted she felt alive with him. I read the list several times. It stung, but it also illuminated something important. Clarity isn't always comfortable, but it is necessary. By midday, I realized I could no longer exist in the constant gray space of uncertainty. I needed to decide how to proceed, not impulsively, not out of anger, but with intention. I started drafting the boundaries I would need if our marriage were to survive. Transparency in communication, consistency in effort, and evidence of commitment, not just promises. And I wrote a second set. The steps I would take if I needed to protect myself and my well-being, including the possibility of separating, legally or emotionally, if trust could not be rebuilt. Writing these things made me feel like I was standing upright again after months of being bent under the weight of doubt and distance. That night, I lay in bed, feeling the first small sense of control I had experienced since discovering the affair. For the first time, I realized that surviving love at a distance and surviving betrayal wasn't about clinging to someone else. It was about reclaiming yourself. And I knew that before I could consider reconciling, I needed to walk this path alone for a while. The following days felt surreal, as if I were living in a parallel version of my own life. The apartment, the city streets, even my reflection in the mirror were familiar, but everything inside me had shifted. I realized that for months, I had been surviving on routines and memories, letting my identity revolve around someone else's choices. Now, I had to find my center again. I returned to my old habits, the small ones that I had abandoned, morning runs, journaling, and preparing meals without thinking of anyone else. I started cooking for myself, savoring flavors and textures I had once ignored. I even rediscovered my favorite playlists, songs I hadn't listened to in years, and allowed myself to sing along aloud, letting the sound fill the apartment like a reminder that I existed fully, even without her. Work became both distraction and focus. I poured myself into projects, not to escape, but to feel capable, productive, and connected to something tangible. Emails and deadlines grounded me, reminded me that the world didn't stop because my heart felt fractured. But it wasn't just about routines. I reached out to friends I had neglected, people who had seen us through different stages of life. Conversations that once seemed ordinary now carried weight. Laughter, honesty, shared stories, human connection that reminded me I was more than my grief or my longing. Evenings were hardest. The quiet felt heavier than ever. Sometimes I'd sit on the balcony, staring at the lights of the city, imagining her in her new life, imagining him, imagining the distance that had grown between us, not just physical, but emotional. And yet, even in that ache, I felt something new, resilience. A subtle awareness that I could exist, breathe, and even find joy without holding on to illusions. The pain was real, but it was no longer paralyzing. I had begun to reclaim my life, piece by piece, memory by memory, breath by breath. It was in this liminal space, neither fully with her nor completely without, that I realized the first truth of surviving love from a distance. Before you can decide whether to rebuild a relationship, you must rebuild yourself. One evening, just as I was finishing dinner, my phone rang. Elena's name flashed on the screen. I froze, staring at it. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part wanted to pick up, desperate to hear her voice, to feel the connection I had once depended on. I answered. "Daniel," she began, hesitant. Her voice carried the familiar warmth I had missed, but also a tension I had come to recognize. "Hi," I said evenly. "Hi. I just wanted to hear your voice," she said. "To know you're okay." I exhaled slowly, sitting back in my chair. "I'm managing," I replied. Silence followed. Not awkward, not comfortable. Just the weight of months laid bare. "I've been thinking," she continued after a pause. "About us. About what happened. About everything I did wrong." I nodded, listening but careful not to respond too quickly. I had learned that words alone, no matter how sincere, could not undo the breach of trust. "I miss you," she said softly. "And I want to try. I want to fix things if you'll let me." I felt the old ache, the pull of love that had never truly disappeared. But I also felt the edge of something I had only begun to understand, self-preservation. "Trying," I said quietly, "means more than words. It means actions. It means consistency. And it also means honesty. No half-truths. No excuses. No, I didn't mean to." She was silent for a long moment. I could hear her breathing through the line. "I understand," she whispered. "I need time," I said firmly, "to see if this is possible, to see if I can trust again. If you're serious, you'll understand that." Another pause, then a soft, almost broken, "I do." We hung up shortly after. The call had changed nothing externally. She was still abroad. I was still home. The affair had still happened. But inside me, something shifted. I realized that trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It isn't restored with declarations of love. It is earned, slowly, deliberately, through repeated evidence. And for the first time since that awful day in her lab, I felt like I might be able to face the possibility of reconciliation, or, if it failed, face separation with integrity. Either way, I had begun to reclaim the power to choose, not to react, not to plead, not to wait passively. Over the next few weeks, I began setting small, deliberate boundaries with Elena. Not to punish her, not out of spite, but to protect myself, and to see if she could meet me halfway. I limited our calls to times when I could truly engage, instead of answering automatically out of habit. I asked questions that required honesty, not vague reassurances. I told her when I needed space, when I needed to process, when I needed to sit with my thoughts without interruption. She sometimes hesitated, confused by the firmness in my voice. "Why are you doing this?" she asked once. "Because love isn't just words," I said. "It's action, and I need to know if we can create something real again, or if I'm holding on to a version of us that doesn't exist anymore." There were moments when she complied eagerly, showing initiative, asking questions about my life, my feelings, my routines. And in those moments, I felt a faint hope stir, a fragile possibility that she understood the work required to rebuild what had been broken. Other times, she struggled. Calls went long, questions were sidestepped, excuses slipped through. And in those moments, I felt the old ache return, the loneliness, the doubt, the memory of betrayal. But now, instead of panicking, I observed. I noted patterns. I reminded myself that my worth didn't depend on her consistency. I also began documenting my feelings daily. Journaling became a tool not just for reflection, but for accountability, to myself. Each entry reminded me what I had endured, what I needed, and what I was willing to tolerate. For the first time since the affair, I felt in control, not of her, not of her choices, but of my own. And that, I realized, was the beginning of true healing. Long-distance love could survive betrayal, I thought, but only if both sides were willing to confront truth, take responsibility, and meet halfway. And now, for the first time, I could see if she truly would. A week later, Elena surprised me. She sent a small video clip of herself walking along a river near her apartment. No words, just the soft sound of water and the city around her. At first, I hesitated before watching. But when I did, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, a glimpse of connection. She began making an effort. Not grand gestures, not dramatic apologies, but small, consistent actions that reflected thoughtfulness. A text asking how my day went, followed by a genuine wait for my answer. A voice note sharing a funny story, just to make me smile. Photos of her environment, not for me to watch her life, but to share a moment together. I noticed the difference immediately. She wasn't trying to convince me with words. She was showing up. And for the first time since the betrayal, I allowed myself to feel hope. Hope, however, was fragile. Each effort I noticed was a test in my mind. Consistent, deliberate, not performative. Could I trust her actions after everything? Could I distinguish genuine effort from guilt or fear? I reminded myself daily, healing is not linear. Trust isn't rebuilt in a week. Love isn't restored by apology alone. But effort, consistent, patient effort, was a start. That weekend, we had a video call that lasted hours. No pressure, no expectation, just conversation. We laughed over old memories, shared small victories from our daily lives. She listened when I spoke about my routines, my struggles, my growth in her absence. It wasn't the same as being in the same room. Distance still existed, but the emotional space felt smaller, more navigable. I realized then that perhaps the true test of long-distance love isn't surviving the miles. It's surviving the betrayals, the cracks, the doubts, and still choosing to meet each other halfway. For the first time in months, I felt cautiously optimistic that we might navigate this together, or, at the very least, that I could face the future without being broken by the past. Even as Elena's small gestures of effort began to ease some of my anxiety, there remained a weight I couldn't ignore, the unspoken questions. I found myself asking silently, repeatedly, in the quiet moments of my day. Why did it happen? Was it just distance? Was I enough? Could she have chosen differently? These questions hovered between us during calls. I didn't voice them, not yet. Not because I was afraid to confront her, but because I knew some answers couldn't be given in words. They had to be lived, demonstrated through action. Still, the mind has a way of creating shadows. When she laughed at something minor, I analyzed it. When she paused to respond, I wondered if her thoughts were elsewhere. And when she admitted to enjoying her new life abroad, a flicker of old fear returned. I realized that rebuilding trust was not about forcing certainty. It was about observing patterns over time and determining whether love could coexist with honesty and consistency. To cope, I began doubling down on my own life. I spent more time with friends. I returned to my art. I pursued small goals I had set aside. Each accomplishment, no matter how trivial, reminded me that my life could exist independently of Elena, even as I still loved her. At night, when I lay alone, the ache remained. But instead of panic or despair, I felt a subtle shift, the knowledge that I could survive her choices, survive distance, and survive betrayal. It was a delicate balance, holding love in one hand and self-preservation in the other, but for the first time, I felt capable of it. After weeks of careful rebuilding, Elena suggested a visit. Not an extended stay, just a few days together. She wanted to show me that she could be fully present, that her commitment wasn't just words over a screen. I agreed, cautiously. The moment I arrived at her apartment, the air between us was different. No forced smiles, no heavy silence. Just two people trying, tentatively, to meet halfway. We cooked dinner together that night. Small things, washing vegetables, stirring sauces, felt significant. Physical closeness had once been easy, natural. Now it required mindfulness. I felt each touch, each glance, each shared laugh as a reminder that connection could exist again, slowly, deliberately. During the evening, we talked, not about the affair, not about past pain, but about present realities. How we had changed, what we had learned about ourselves, what boundaries we needed moving forward. For the first time, I felt that rebuilding trust wasn't just possible, it was tangible. Not complete, not fully healed, but visible in actions rather than words. Later, as we sat quietly on the couch, I realized something profound. Distance had tested us in ways proximity never could. Betrayal had exposed weaknesses and cracks. Yes, but it had also forced us to confront the raw truths of our relationship. In that quiet living room, I allowed myself to hope, not blindly, not fully, but cautiously, for the first time in months. Hope, I realized, was fragile, but it was necessary, and sometimes it was the first step towards something real. Even as the visit continued, doubts lingered. They weren't loud or dramatic. They were subtle, creeping into my thoughts at the quietest moments. Every time Elena reached for my hand, I asked myself, is this genuine? Or is it guilt speaking? One afternoon, while walking through a small park near her apartment, I finally voiced one of the questions that had been eating at me. Do you ever wonder if things would have been different if I weren't so far away? I asked. She stopped walking and looked at me carefully. Sometimes, she admitted. But it doesn't mean I don't want this now. It doesn't mean I'm choosing him over you. Distance complicated everything, but it also taught me what I truly value. Her honesty stung and soothed at the same time. Stung because it reminded me of the pain we had endured. Soothing because it was real, unfiltered, and undefensive. I realized that part of rebuilding trust wasn't just observing her actions. It was confronting my own insecurities, my own fears, and my own need for reassurance. Long-distance love requires two people willing to face uncomfortable truths together. That evening, back in her apartment, we sat quietly on the balcony. I watched the city lights flicker in the distance and felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I didn't know if we were fully healed. I didn't know if our relationship would survive the months ahead. But I knew we were trying, and that effort, even imperfect, was something I could hold on to. Sometimes, I realized, trust isn't rebuilt in grand gestures. It's rebuilt in the small, consistent choices, showing up, being present, acknowledging the past, and meeting each other in honesty. The next few days were a mix of quiet intimacy and careful observation. I noticed how she lingered when I entered a room, how she made small efforts to include me in her routines. Yet every action carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The memory of what had happened was still there, silent but persistent. We talked more openly now, about fears, about distance, about the mistakes that had nearly cost us everything. I shared how lonely I had felt, how I had questioned my worth, how the betrayal had carved a hollow in my heart. She listened, truly listened, without defensiveness. And I saw in her eyes that she was beginning to understand the depth of what her choices had done. Still, progress felt fragile. A joke that once would have been harmless could trigger unease. A glance she cast towards something I couldn't see could make my chest tighten. Trust is not a light switch. It is a fragile bridge, built one careful plank at a time. One evening, she turned to me, hesitating. I know I've hurt you, she said, and I don't expect you to forget. But I want to try. I want us to rebuild. I nodded slowly. I want that too. But we have to do it step by step. No pretending. No shortcuts. That night, as we lay in bed, together, yet still cautious, I realized that the path forward was not about erasing the past. It was about holding it in one hand and hope in the other, learning to walk carefully between them. I fell asleep with a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, we were walking it honestly. Over the next week, we focused on rebuilding small routines together. Not grand romantic gestures, but tiny, meaningful moments. Cooking breakfast side by side. Watching the same TV show and laughing at the same jokes. Sharing thoughts about work, friends, and mundane life. Each moment felt deliberate, a conscious effort to reclaim intimacy that distance and betrayal had fractured. I realized how much I had missed these simple connections. The act of being present, fully attentive, without screens or time zones or unspoken secrets, felt almost miraculous. We talked openly about the past, about the affair, about the loneliness that had led to it, and about the cracks in our relationship that distance had exposed. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply explained, and I listened, not to excuse her, but to understand. I shared my fears too. About trust, about vulnerability, about whether I could fully love her again without holding back. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply listened, absorbing each word, and promised to meet me in honesty every day. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when old pains surfaced, small irritations, misinterpreted words, fleeting doubts. But each time, we confronted them instead of letting them fester. Each small confrontation, handled with care, became a tiny bridge across the gap that had grown between us. By the end of the week, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: cautious optimism. Not naive hope, not blind trust, just the quiet confidence that we were capable of trying, together, with open eyes and hearts. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt that perhaps long-distance love could survive, not untouched, not the same, but stronger in its honesty and effort. As the visit drew on, I began to test the emotional waters. Small things, like holding her hand during a walk, sharing a story about my day, or letting my guard down just a little, became exercises in trust. Each time, I measured her response carefully. Did she respond with patience? With presence? With sincerity? She did. Most of the time. Her words were measured, her gestures deliberate. I could feel her effort. And it made me realize that rebuilding wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about creating new patterns, ones that could withstand distance, time, and the mistakes of the past. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. A pause that felt too long. A laugh that sounded forced. But I reminded myself that neither of us was perfect. Rebuilding was messy. It was uneven. And that was okay. One night, we sat on her balcony, the city lights stretching out below us. I told her how scared I had been after discovering the affair, how much the distance had magnified my fears, how deeply I had loved her, even when she had faltered. She listened quietly, squeezing my hand. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm so sorry. I see now how much I took for granted. But I want to be here, really here, with you." Her words weren't enough to erase the past, but they were enough to show me that she was willing to meet me where I needed her, to face the discomfort, to share the responsibility of rebuilding what was broken. And in that moment, I felt a small but undeniable shift inside me. Fear was still there, yes, but it was accompanied by something stronger, hope rooted in effort, not illusion. As the days of her visit passed, I began to confront a truth I had long avoided. Distance is not just physical. It shapes perception, amplifies insecurities, and can quietly erode trust even in the strongest relationships. Being with her again in person made that crystal clear. The laughter, the shared meals, the late-night conversations, all of it reminded me of what we had lost and what we could rebuild, but it also showed me how fragile long-distance love can be. I realized that the affair wasn't simply about physical proximity. It had been about emotional availability. Being far apart, we had drifted into separate lives, separate emotional worlds. I had clung to her presence in memory, while she had sought immediacy elsewhere. Sitting together on the balcony one night, I said, "I've been thinking, maybe we can't pretend that distance doesn't affect us. Maybe we have to acknowledge it openly, every day." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "I know, and I want to make sure that we don't fall into the same patterns again. I want to choose you, every day, even when I'm far away." I felt a quiet reassurance in her words. Not the naive kind, not blind faith, but the kind that comes from understanding the problem and committing to do better. That night, I slept with a sense of cautious peace. Distance would still challenge us. It would still test our patience, our trust, our resilience. But now, for the first time since the betrayal, I felt that we might survive it. Not because it would be easy, but because we had begun to confront it honestly. The last day of her visit arrived too quickly. We packed her things in silence, each movement deliberate, careful, as if we were trying not to disturb the fragile balance we had rebuilt. Before leaving, we sat on the couch one last time. I looked at her, really looked at her, the way the light hit her hair, the subtle lines of worry that had deepened over the months, the warmth in her eyes that I had never stopped loving. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said softly. "I know it's hard, but I want you to know. I'm committed. No more half measures." I nodded. "I can see that, and I appreciate it. But I also know that rebuilding trust is a process. It doesn't end when you leave." She reached for my hand, squeezing gently. "I'll do whatever it takes. Distance won't be an excuse anymore. I felt a flicker of hope, stronger now, steadier than before. But I also felt the weight of reality. Love at a distance is a delicate balance. Effort alone cannot erase history, only shape the future. We hugged tightly, neither of us speaking for a long moment. In that embrace, I felt both the ache of separation and the reassurance that effort could exist across miles. As I watched her leave, I realized something crucial. The man who had arrived in her city, broken and uncertain, was not the same man standing here now. I had grown. I had learned. I had set boundaries. And I had begun to reclaim myself. Distance would always be a challenge, but now, at least, it felt navigable. After Elena's departure, the apartment felt quiet in a new way. Not empty, not abandoned, but calm, like a space finally ready for me to inhabit fully again. I settled back into my routines, more intentional this time. Morning runs, journaling, cooking my own meals. I noticed details I had long ignored. The way sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the gentle creak of the floorboards. Small moments that reminded me life was still moving forward, even with the ache of distance lingering. I also noticed something else. My thoughts of Elena no longer carried the same sharp edge. The initial pain, the betrayal, the anxiety, it was still there, but tempered. Now it existed alongside hope, effort, and recognition of the choices we were both making. We kept talking, but differently now. No rushed calls, no constant need for reassurance. Just honest conversations about our days, our struggles, and our emotions. Every interaction became a deliberate act of rebuilding, rather than an automatic expectation. I realized that surviving love from a distance, and surviving betrayal, required patience, resilience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It also required something harder, letting go of the illusion that things could ever return to exactly how they were. Instead, we were creating something new. Not perfect, not unbroken, but authentic. And for the first time in months, I felt that maybe this authenticity could carry us forward. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Elena and I continued our relationship long distance, but differently, more intentionally, more honestly, and with boundaries that protected both of us. Trust wasn't fully restored, but it was being rebuilt, step by step. I learned that love alone is never enough. Distance exposes weaknesses, insecurities, and unspoken resentments. Betrayal doesn't always come from malice. It can come from unmet needs, loneliness, or poor decisions, but it leaves lasting consequences. I also learned that survival requires self-respect. I could love Elena and still protect myself. I could forgive her mistakes without forgetting them. I could hope for reconciliation while understanding that the outcome might still be uncertain. Most importantly, I learned that personal growth doesn't wait for someone else. I rediscovered my passions, rebuilt routines, and strengthened friendships. I found that I could exist fully and authentically, even in the absence of love, betrayal, or distance. If I were to offer advice to anyone navigating long-distance love or any relationship shaken by betrayal, it would be this. Be honest with yourself and your partner. Set clear boundaries to protect your heart. Observe actions, not just words. Reclaim your life, your passions, and your identity. Allow yourself time to process grief, anger, and doubt. Understand that rebuilding takes effort from both sides, and sometimes it may not be enough. As I sit now, reflecting on the months behind me, I feel a quiet resilience. The pain, the betrayal, the distance, they all shaped me. And while love at a distance is never easy, it taught me the most valuable lesson of all: survival, healing, and growth begin within oneself. I can love fully, I can trust cautiously, and I can face the future, whatever it holds, with my heart intact.